Richard was a vice president of international sales for a large manufacturer of police and military equipment. In 2007, he was arrested for having paid bribes to foreign public officials. He cooperated with the US Department of Justice and other authorities. And as part of his own plea agreement, Richard was sentenced in 2012 and served 14 months at a federal prison camp, returning home in December 2013. A few months after his release, Richard contacted me. He found my name on the internet and he wanted to discuss compliance issues. I was familiar with Richard's story and was at first surprised by the contact. I decided, nevertheless, to accept his proposal, and we had a conference call. During that conference call, I realized that he had much to say on compliance. I realized that he knew things that not only I didn't know, but also that I would never know, even if I specialize on anti-corruption issues. He had been on the other side, and he had months and years to think about his experience and to draw lessons. I was so keen to learn more that I took a flight to meet him in his house near New York in Connecticut. We spent 3 fascinating days speaking about corruption-related issues, and we decided to collaborate to exchange ideas, to write common articles, and to comment on each other's posts. From the beginning, Richard shared with me his desire to help business people working on the front lines of international trade to avoid making the same mistakes. He explained to me how he wanted to help families avoid the suffering they obviously go through if the husband, the father, the mother, the brother, or the sister is in jail for having paid a bribe. I have been then very happy to see him addressing executive committees and boards of directors to convince them about the importance of compliance. He is now internationally recognized by the international compliance community as a major contributor, and you are now traveling the world. In 2017, he was named by Compliance Week as a top mind in the field of governance, risk, and compliance, and was ranked one of the Ethisphere's 100 most influential in business ethics. So I'm very happy to have Richard with us tonight, and let's have a dialogue. First, I would like you to introduce you a little bit. How did you get to be an international sales vice president in the defense business? And did your career started with an international focus at the beginning?
Well, thank you, Philippe, and thank you for the introduction. It's very emotional for me to be here. Philippe and I have been talking about me coming to Paris for 3 years, and I just recently had my international travel privileges restored. So it's really such an honor to be here, and thank you, Philippe. So I did not want to be an international sales vice president when I grew up. I wanted to be a foreign policy professor. That was my first passion. So after graduating university, I entered a PhD, a doctorate program in foreign policy at the University of Virginia. And Philippe, about halfway through that program, I received 2 interesting offers. One was from the Reagan White House, so I guess I'm telling you a little bit how old I am, for a foreign policy internship, which I'm sure you can imagine was a prize for a young graduate student. But the other was from my father and my cousin to enter what was a 3rd-generation family business, manufacturing, started by my great-grandfather in 1888, manufacturing what we call bulletproof vests. So as compelling as that White House offer was and continuing my studies, taking the baton in the fourth generation in that business was overwhelming for me. Now this, hopefully we'll talk a little bit more about this later on, because Philippe, I would spend the next 10 years starting in that business and later moving on to a multinational, focusing on sales in the US markets.
And what kind of training did you have for this new business for you? How much were you prepared for working internationally?
Well, what happened, Philippe, is after 10 years focusing on the US marketplace, US military, US law enforcement, what we think of as low risk, high integrity, strong institutions of state, an organized civil service, I get the offer in 1997 because the company wants to do what a lot of companies want to do. They want to invest in lucrative growth, the overseas markets. So they were going to hire a vice president of international sales, which I thought was very compelling. So I, as fusing together my academic background and my sales experience, so in 1997, I take the role as the vice president of international sales of this large publicly traded manufacturer of a wide portfolio of defense products. So Philippe, what training did I have? Well, before I took my first flight, and I would spend the next 10 years overseas around 250 days a year, part-time residing out of the United Kingdom, the company said, here is the FCPA. Study it, understand it, and if you don't understand it, we'll get you resources to help you. Now, in 1997, that was probably a reasonable compliance program, right?
Yes, probably.
No, I didn't need any resources. I understood conspiring or bribing a foreign official to gain or retain business was illegal. And so I start traveling the world, and I'm going to develop an agent of networks, what we've been talking about today, intermediaries, agents, distributors. That was going to be my route to developing the market.
So if I'm very, very direct, how did you go from a White House offer to prison? How did it start? Was it immediately with what we call grand corruption or with this little facilitation payment? How were you confronted first to this issue?
Well, that's direct and reasonably polite, so thank you. It is a good question. How did it start? So I find myself in a place called Tierra del Fuego. It's the southern tip of Argentina. And I'm there meeting with my intermediary, right, my agent. Now, Philippe, this is someone who I had done some small transactions with in the past. I had no indication of corruption or corrupt intent. This isn't someone that you're going to find on a Panama paper database. He had a bank account in his name, in his country, and he was providing legitimate business services, helping me to understand the marketplace, introducing me to end users to do product demonstrations, doing translations. And I was there to talk about a rather large upcoming opportunity. And he shares with me, I think it was over coffee or lunch, he said, Richard, as part of my success and my success fee, I pay tolls to win tenders. Now, I knew right there what he meant by tolls. In the next 15 years, I would hear some very colorful words to describe a bribe, from paying tolls to making people happy, to taking care of people. I've heard sunshine payments, and I read an SEC filing where they were called chocolates. The one word that I have yet to hear used to describe a foreign bribe is bribe. So Toby, I bet you in your data dives you don't see much bribe out there.
When he mentioned tolls, you understand what it meant, and did you realize it was wrong?
So Philippe, what was interesting, before I get to the did I know it was wrong, what I still remember about that conversation is he wasn't asking me for anything. He didn't say, Richard, the tolls are going up. We need a bigger commission rate. He didn't say there are more toll takers. We need a bigger success fee, because like most agents, he was paid on a success fee basis. He's just saying, this is how we get it done around here, and you're on a winning team. So when we speak of a slippery slope, that's where mine started, as I would hear over the next few years in different interesting, colorful words, agents and intermediaries telling me how they were paying tolls to win. And yes, right there in Argentina, I knew that just by the promise and the understanding of what he was doing, that I was now a co-conspirator to violating the FCPA. So I didn't go to prison for nodding my head, but that's how it started.
And did you rationalize it? Because I know you. I know you are a genuine character. I know you have a strong sense of integrity. But nevertheless, you started to put your foot on the slippery slope. So I imagine you gave some thought about it, no? You rationalize it?
I did rationalize it in a number of different ways. But before I share that and what I was thinking for a moment, just to be clear, Philippe didn't ask me to come all the way from New York to Paris to engage in a session on ethical spinning. And I mean that from the sense of, for me, cheating was a choice. Nobody forced me to pay a bribe, okay? These are decisions that I ultimately accepted responsibility for, and I went to prison for them. So I'm not trying to say, oh, it was the company's fault, they pressured me, or to deflect responsibility on other individuals or organizations. So with that said, yes, I'm happy to share what I was thinking and sort of pull the curtain back and hope that you might think about your own compliance efforts. And does it engage with this sort of behavioral risk?
I interrupt you because I know a little bit what you are going to say, and I think it is very important because some of your people on the front line might have the same kind of thinking about putting a foot on a slippery slope. Please continue.
So the first thing I was thinking is, at the bottom of Argentina, 600 miles from Antarctica, I didn't think I was in the earshot of international law enforcement or my company's compliance program, right? I'm thinking, I'm never going to get caught. When my family said, what were you thinking? When my defense attorney said, what were you thinking? That was my first reaction, is these conversations would play out all over the world in remote areas, and the only people present were usually me and the intermediary. But more than that, I started thinking about my commercial objectives, right? My incentives. And unlike those US marketplaces where I grew up in sales, in many parts of the world where Nat was talking about, corruption exists at $100 million a day, guess what? The institutions of state are not strong. Procurement personnel are inadequately trained and they're poorly compensated, and procurements are marked by secrecy, a lack of transparency. I started to think, Philippe, from where I sit, what does the company really want? Do they want compliance or do they want sales? Because I started to think, I don't think I can deliver both. I looked at it as a zero-sum game.
So I understand from what you said that the message, the tone at the top, that compliance really matters is extremely important. It means everyone should know that at the end, the company should decide to go for a compliant business, and the message should be loud and clear, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, for me, at that point in time, the compliance message, me signing that FCPA paperwork, let's call that a spoken message. The spoken message of don't violate the FCPA. The unspoken message, which was a if we can say this, a loud unspoken message, was a very aggressive set of commercial objectives, of incentives that, and Philippe, I didn't call up my company and say, what do you really want, compliance or sales? I didn't ask my peers. I didn't seek guidance. This was a debate I took on my own. I made these compliance decisions on the fly. I took it into my own hands. But to me, the paycheck and the voice of win above all else, when I would make that calculation, the paycheck would win.
And we mentioned the World Bank work on corruption and so on, and it is said that probably corruption in Africa means that probably the price are 20 to 30% higher than they should. At that time, did you think about the impact of bribery on the local environment?
And that's a very good point that you made, because I saw countries and end users paying 2 and 3 times what they should be paying for product because of corruption. So, Philippe, I was ethically numb, right? From nice business class lounges and inner city hotels and nice restaurants, I wasn't spending my evening on the Transparency International website thinking about how corruption starves societies of good governance, of human rights, of economic development. I'm thinking, and go back to Argentina, who's really getting hurt here? I was never pulling layers out of a bulletproof vest. So the quality of the product was still a first-class product. So I'm thinking, the company gets the sale. They might even have to hire employees or add a second shift to manufacture the order. I make my commercial objectives, my quota, my bonus. The intermediary moves on to the next sale, and the poorly paid public official might get a little something to make ends meet. So I'm thinking, from the business perspective, it's a win-win. And I was really ethically blind to the consequences of my decisions on society, on my former employer, and regrettably on my family.
And let's talk a little bit about third parties, because you were not paying bribes directly, you were relying on third parties. Can you describe a little bit more about the interaction with third parties?
So we have had a very robust discussion here today, much of it addressing third-party and intermediary risk. From my experience and perspective, they don't necessarily share our concerns. I've heard everything from these Western anti-bribery conventions have no place in our society. Gift giving has been a part of our culture. It's tolerated. There's no will to prosecute it here, all the way to it's legal here.
What kind of message you will convey to the executive committee?
So this goes back a little bit, Philippe, to the first blog that we did together, where we talked about how commercial objectives, incentives can be a red flag right there for future corruption risk. I mean, my bad performance, my bad behavior hid behind good performance for 10 years, right? And whether you look at Volkswagen or Wells Fargo, bad performance and bad incentive systems can remain invisible for a long time until it's too late. So when I talk to business leadership, it's to help before giving them corruption and anti-corruption awareness, it's giving them the business awareness that when their objectives run afoul of market reality, okay, whether it's producing cars or opening up bank accounts, or in my own case, sales, right there, you are putting in a dangerous reward system that can put people at risk. And there have been some interesting surveys lately, Philippe, that ask if compliance leaders have a line of sight into those risk decisions. An incentive decision is a risk decision. Setting commercial objectives is a risk discussion. And there's still a majority of compliance leaders that don't have a voice at that table when those commercial discussions are happening. So when I talk to business leadership and executives and boards, the first conversation is, are you getting everybody around the table to talk about what you might think of as business risk, setting commercial objectives in low integrity regions? That is a significant risk decision. Let everybody talk about it together.
Thank you, Richard. I'm sure that many of you have some questions to Richard. So I propose to open the floor for a small moment. Yes, and Nathalie, may I ask you to introduce you, please?
Yes, Nathalie Gouache from Technip FMC. I'm Chief Legal Compliance Officer. Just maybe sharing experience. I think that the exposure is coming from the ground. This is absolutely clear, and it was very clear for me. You talk about compliance versus culture. I think that the people have to understand that compliance is also about protecting the people. It's absolutely not acceptable to have some guys sitting on a vessel, waiting for clearance on customs, having the big pressure to get demands, and not having the right tool, or at least the comfort that he has to take it up.
Right.
Because he doesn't have the global picture. And rightfully you mentioned that the business is there to help. Yes, to understand and to help and to solve the matter. So I think that this is something that is to be really encouraged. And I like very much the idea of the business guys sitting and recognizing this. Because, of course, as compliance officers, we can carry on with a lot of awareness sessions, and I think that we have to tailor those at the level of what is to be heard at this level by the ground and by the people in the operation. But it's good, at least, that they recognize that the message is coming from their peers, that not only it's important to why we do business, but how do we do business. And at the top level, they might not have this, this level of detailed sensitivity, but it's important that the people can get comfort, they can get it up and speak up. Experience. It's true.
I agree, and thank you for the comment. And I think the most important band in an organization to make sure that the how we get business done volume is always high are your regional level managers, right? The people that your commercial workforce report into, the people that they talk to the most. Because how are they measured? At some level, everyone's measured on commercial objectives. And there have been some recent studies that show that those are the leaders that can amplify, distort, or discard an anti-bribery compliance program. So if there's any band that needs to really be your anti-bribery ambassadors from the business, it's certainly that level of business leadership at the mid-level. And I think to your other point, when compliance leaders are reinforcing with the workforce that we are not just a set of policies, rules, and procedures, we are actually here because we want you successful. Okay, we are your partners to success, but we also want you safe. We want you back home with your families. And I think when compliance leaders show that duty of care to people as individuals who are working away from their families and in very difficult environments, then people feel a very personal connection with those who do want to keep them safe.
If I may add something, when in another life, I've been in jail, but it was on the front line somewhere in Serbia during the war. That was another story, and it was not for paying a bribe. So for many people, a jail is something theoretical. You know, when I met Richard in his house, and later on when I met your wife, then. And when she explained to me she had to travel every 2 weeks to cross the United States, to go to see you on the other side of the screen. And when you realize that behind the suffering of someone in jail, you have also the suffering of the family, of the friends, of the children, then I do believe that we compliance officers have a huge, huge responsibility to explain what it is at stake. It's easy to speak about fines, hundreds of millions, yes. But being away from his own family and thinking the way your children are looking at you because you are in jail is something very, very important. So I do believe we have a huge responsibility in explaining all the details of what is behind the curtain. Another question? Yes, Philippe Keubel on the one side and Blandine near to Philippe Keubel.
Yes, Philippe Keubel from Orange. We heard today that still $100 million are paid a day in bribes. We hear that some compliance officers are desperate. However, I believe that today we have a better consciousness of our executives. We can put in place compliance programs, tone at the top. I believe we have today a situation which basically is better today as 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, clearly. So my question is the following. We could be horrified today when we see what we do, what we put in place as compliance program, if we compare the situation today as what we had 10 years ago, right? So your experience dealing with DOJ or FCPA, prosecutors and so on, do you believe people are aware that today we have a situation which is better than 10 years ago, and that we cannot judge situations 10 years, 15 years ago with our today's view of compliance?
The awareness is absolute, right? I mean, anti-corruption awareness, I don't know. First of all, to me, it's different than when I first started looking at this field 4 years ago. Because 4 years ago, when I started looking at the compliance discourse and debate, and Philippe, we talked about this, everything was about what do the regulators want, right? If there's a problem, how do we demonstrate that we have a robust program that's going to minimize the consequences of what happened? I didn't hear much of a voice of, do we have a compliance program that makes sense to the field? Is it calibrated to the real world risk that our commercial teams face? Now, today I'm seeing that, and I think even more so in Europe, I'm seeing that holistic shift to, we do care how our workforce understands the program, right? We want to make sure that our program is calibrated to the real world risk that they face. So to me, the most important advance that I've seen just in 4 years is sort of that pivot from almost that criminal law lens that a lot of compliance programs developed from, to the more holistic approach of how do we keep our workforce commercially successful and safe. And I think that's what inspires a workforce, right? Rules, I think, inspire maybe minimalism, but when you show, I think, that duty of care to say the company speaks with one voice, compliance, objectives, incentives, they all speak to the same message. That's what I'm starting to see the shift the most. That really inspires for me that the function is evolving more into the business.
But there was another issue behind Philippe Keubel's question, which is really difficult. I will not go into details, but I've been asked to bring some elements to a trial which is going on overseas in the UK for a contract which was signed 12 years ago. And a sales agent was involved in bribery. But 12 years ago, companies were not aware, more or less, except some salesperson, but management was not aware that a sales agent could be a risk. And so they were not designing a compliance program with a strong monitoring of sales agent. And sure, today, the judges are looking at what the company should have done with a sales agent policy. And this is really, really difficult, and it terrifies me. And it's really why I think that certification is very important, in the sense that it demonstrates at a certain time the company had appropriate steps. And maybe in 5 years, it will be old-fashioned, probably. But at least when you say, I have been certified in years, I don't know, 2012, it means that in 2012, you were implementing the best practices. And of course, for a judge, he doesn't know that there is a history of compliance, and he has difficulties to understand that the thresholds have increased. There was another question from Blandine, and then from Domingos. Blandine.
Yeah, Blandine Cordier-Palas. I'm the managing partner of BCP Executive Search, and now I'm recruiting compliance officers. And when I'm happy to see that there is a shift, but when I go and see some channel managers, they are not all aware of what compliance means as a culture, and not only as a compliance program. And more importantly, they do not want to give a lot of means to put in place the compliance programs. And my question is, because of your experience, and thank you for sharing that, that's so important. I'm very grateful about that. When you share your experience with top managers, with COMEX, with board members, hopefully, how do they react? Do they realize that compliance is not only a program, it's a shift of culture, and they should give means to compliance officers, positioning them at the right level in the organization so that they are legitimate, credible, and what they say will be understood and taken into account. And it's not only a question of expertise, but it's more a question of holistic program, environment, culture.
Yeah, I mean, from my experience, there is that shift at the board level, but I think and it's all evolving, right? But some of that's coming off of the front page of the news, right? There have been some interesting surveys about board awareness of reputation risk, right? Reputational risk. So we have these world-class brands, Mylan, Wells Fargo, Volkswagen. There's no board member that wants to see their company having that kind of exposure. So I think part of it is this understanding that in our world of hyper-transparency, where through our Twitter sphere, things don't percolate very long. Bad news travels faster than good news these days. That there is an awareness that compliance needs to be an embedded part of business leadership. And they need to have that line of sight into things like commercial objectives and incentives that just a short time ago were like a peripheral part of the compliance debate, where now they're definitely in the mainstream of the discussion, which to me is important. Thank you.
Thank you. Domingos, and then Diane, and maybe we will finish after Diane. Domingos.
Thanks, Philippe. Domingos Paiva. I'm a lawyer both in France and Brazil. Mr. Bistrong, please, in order to encourage the staff to report bribery or suspicious activity, do you think it could be a good idea to promise payments for the sales agent that report something unusual? Do you think it could be a strong tool to encourage the staff to report bribery, promising them bonus or payments or so else?
You mean, excuse me, the sales staff to be encouraged?
Yes. You yourself, let's say, when you faced the bribe in Argentina some years ago, if you have had at this time the idea that if you reported the bribe, you could get money from your employer, do you think it could be an easy way to encourage staff?
So it's hard for me to comment on the financial rewards of whistleblowing. From a commercial perspective, I look at it as, are you encouraging people to speak up if they see something that doesn't look right? And no matter how bad that might be, if it means unwinding a forecast, if it means dissolving a transaction, that they're not going to be penalized financially or otherwise for doing the right thing. And I think part of that issue is it takes a village to ship an international order or to deliver services, right? Think of all the people in logistics, in finance, in sales order processing that are part of an international transaction. And I don't say this in a derogatory sense, but no matter how low they might be on an organization chart, to those people who see a lot, do they feel like if they see something that just doesn't look right, even if it's paper handed to them by their supervisor, do they feel like they're just a small gear in a big company and I'm going to do my job? Or do they feel that they're part of the compliance team and that they have a responsibility to say, I've never seen paperwork like this. I've never seen a commission request like this. I think I need to talk about it. Because again, there's been some recent surveys that demonstrate that those people in those finance and logistics and support, sales order support functions, that they don't feel like they're part of that compliance team. And they are a wonderful set of eyes and ears into your organization. And it's hard for me to comment if you have to incentivize them financially. I think it's more inspiring them emotionally to feel like you are part of that ethics and integrity team.
Thank you, Richard. A last question with you, Dejan.
Yeah, thank you. Dejan Jasnic, ABC Transparency. Your message is strong, and it needs to be strong to go through the company, through the organization, but probably it is very strong because you yourself walked the whole way from the slippery part through the jail, and now you're here. I was wondering, what is your opinion on settlements? These settlements somehow do not reflect what you went through. And on the other hand, I'm reading more and more in newspapers on the number of cases that are being, concluded with a settlement. Just recently, I read an article with a general counsel of a large Swiss bank who commented on the suggestion of one of the authorities to settle on a very huge irregularity they did, that what they demanded was just not market price for the settlement. I mean, market price for a settlement. They are already talking about market price of a settlement. I think this is something diametrically where it is now, what you went through. It is just putting, again, a number on the P&L statement. Thank you.
Well, settlements that are paid from the company's treasury out of shareholder funds to people on the front lines in a commercial workforce, that's very abstract, right? I mean, even the enormity of the fines doesn't, I think, impact people on the commercial workforce. And part of the reason why I painfully talk about going to prison, which was an awful experience, and I got very sick in prison, is to hope that those blogs and those pieces get shared in the commercial workforce, not to make people afraid. I'm not interested in like a scared story. It's more to inspire them that you don't have to go through this, that your company does have a support network for you, but that the consequences are there. And we certainly haven't seen the same robust, even with the Yates memo, even with the pilot program, there are certainly more individual prosecutions in the US and not as much globally. But I think at the end of the day, people in the commercial workforce do need to understand that there are significant implications to their business decisions. And I agree with you. I don't necessarily think that big DPAs and civil forfeitures and fines sort of inspire that thinking.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you for the time you spent with us. May I encourage you to read Richard's blog, to look at the videos he made, and I'm sure you will find it beneficial to use this material in your day-to-day work on this issue. Thank you very much, Richard.
Thank you, Philippe. Thank you, everyone.